there is a symphony that has been called unfinished for nearly 200 years. It has only 2 movements, no finale, no explanation from its composer, and yet it has never disappeared. This is Schubert's Symphony No. 8, a work that stops halfway through, but somehow feels complete. Why that is, and what it tells us about music at the beginning of the 19th century, is the question at the center of this story. Franz Schubert wrote this symphony in Vienna in 1822, at a moment when his life was growing more uncertain, and when the musical world around him was beginning to change. Classical forms were still in place, but new ideas about expression and emotion were starting to press against them. Today I want to spend some time with this symphony, not to solve its mystery, but to understand why it continues to matter. What kind of music stops here? And what kind of listening does it ask of us? If you've been here before, it's wonderful to have you back. And if this is your first time listening to Orpheus's Lyre, I'm glad you found your way here. If the stories I share here speak to you, small gestures like leaving a comment, liking the video, or subscribing to the channel can help them reach others who might enjoy them too. In the early 1820s, Vienna stood at the center of European musical life. Concert halls were active, salons were crowded, and new works circulated constantly among performers, patrons, and critics who followed developments with close attention. Within this environment, Franz Schubert lived a quieter existence. His career unfolded away from the concert stage. He did not tour as a virtuoso or hold a formal court position. Instead, his music found its audience in private rooms, passed among friends who gathered to play, sing, and listen. These informal evenings formed the core of his musical life. A piano, a few chairs, a handful of listeners, and a composer nearby, hearing his work take shape in intimate surroundings. Schubert's productivity during these years was remarkable. By his mid-20s, he had written hundreds of songs, along with symphonies, chamber works, piano pieces, and sacred music. The volume alone suggests urgency, a steady pressure to keep writing, as though the act itself mattered more than any promise of recognition. Recognition, however, remained uncertain. Publishers showed limited interest in his larger works, performances were infrequent, and financial security was fragile. Schubert relied heavily on the support of friends, moving between apartments, rarely settled in one place for long. He belonged to a close-knit circle of poets, students, and artists who believed deeply in his talent and sustained him when practical circumstances grew difficult. The year 1822 marked a turning point in Schubert's life. Until then, his difficulties had been familiar ones: limited income, uncertain prospects, dependence on friends. These were burdens, but they belonged to a pattern he had learned to manage. He wrote constantly, socialized within his circle, and trusted that time would eventually work in his favor. That sense of continuity began to weaken. Sometime during this year, Schubert fell seriously ill. The exact diagnosis remains uncertain, but contemporary accounts and later medical assessments suggest a condition that would follow him for the rest of his life, shaping both his health and his outlook. Treatment options were limited. Recovery was uneven. The illness brought physical suffering, but also something less visible, a growing awareness of vulnerability. For a composer whose life depended on steady work and fragile support, illness carried consequences beyond the body. It interrupted routines, it strained finances, it narrowed the future. Schubert continued to write, but the conditions around his work changed. The confidence of youth, which allows difficulty to feel temporary, gave way to a more cautious awareness of time. Letters from this period suggest anxiety and self-doubt alongside flashes of determination. The unfinished symphony belongs to this moment, shaped by patience, restraint, and a heightened inward focus. What followed is harder to trace. Schubert moved on to other projects. Life continued, altered but ongoing. The manuscript of the unfinished was set aside and remained unheard for decades. What survives are two complete movements and traces of what might have followed, enough to suggest intention, but not enough to explain why the work stopped. To understand why the unfinished symphony mattered, it helps to place it within a moment of transition, a time when the symphony itself was being asked to carry new kinds of meaning. For much of the late 18th century, the symphony belonged to what we now call the classical tradition. Its language prized balance, clarity, and proportion. Musical ideas were introduced, tested, and resolved within forms that promised coherence and control. Drama was present, but it unfolded within boundaries that listeners could recognize and trust. That framework did not disappear overnight, it was stretched. No composer did more to stretch it than Ludwig van Beethoven. Beethoven inherited classical forms and pushed them to their limits. His symphonies expanded in scale, intensity, and emotional ambition. Conflict became central. Struggle was no longer something to be balanced away, but something to be lived through. With works like the Eroica Symphony, first performed 17 years before Schubert began the Unfinished, Beethoven showed that a symphony could embody personal and moral drama on an unprecedented scale. For this reason, the Eroica is sometimes described as the first Romantic symphony, not because it abandons classical structure, but because it asks that structure to bear a new expressive weight. Schubert came of age in the long shadow of that achievement. The Unfinished Symphony still moves within classical outlines. Sonata form remains intact. Themes are developed, keys explored, tension shaped with care. Nothing about the construction suggests a rejection of tradition, and yet the source of expressive power has shifted again. In Schubert's hands, symphonic drama begins to take shape less through confrontation and more through lyric continuity. From the opening bars, the Unfinished leans towards song. The low strings do not present an idea to be argued or challenged. They sustain an emotional state. Long melodic lines carry the music forward, allowing feeling to deepen gradually rather than erupt suddenly. Tension accumulates through continuity, not through opposition. The orchestration reinforces this change in emphasis. Schubert treats instrumental color as expressive in itself. Sounds are spaced widely across the orchestra, with low strings set far below higher winds and upper voices. These choices are not merely functional. They shape atmosphere. They create depth, space, and resonance that invite the listener inward. This becomes especially clear in the development of the first movement, where harmonic tension stretches across registers, instead of driving relentlessly toward resolution. The music feels suspended, attentive to its own sound, willing to linger. Because of these qualities, Schubert's Eighth Symphony is also sometimes called the First Romantic Symphony. The attribution reflects what listeners hear: a symphony in which inner experience, lyric continuity, and color carry as much meaning as structure and drama. What matters more than the label is where the work stands in history. The Unfinished occupies a space between worlds. It inherits classical form, absorbs Beethoven's expansion of expressive range, and then turns inward, toward a romantic concern with mood, memory, and emotional duration. Schubert does not announce this shift, he simply allows the music to follow its own gravity. And in doing so, he shows that the future of the symphony need not lie only in struggle and resolution, but also in reflection, in sound allowed to linger. The question listeners often ask is a simple one. Why did Schubert stop? The honest answer is that we don't know. There is no letter, no diary entry, no reliable account that explains the decision. What remains is the music itself, and the silence that follows it. Scholars have offered many possibilities over the years, ranging from illness to shifting creative focus. But none can be confirmed. What matters is not the speculation, but the fact that the symphony reached a point where it was set aside, without explanation. For decades after Schubert's death, that silence was literal. The manuscript lay untouched in a drawer, kept by a friend who never brought it forward for performance. When the symphony was finally heard in public, long after Schubert was gone, it arrived already shaped by absence. What gives the unfinished its lasting power is not the mystery of why it stops, but the way it reaches its stopping point. The two movements establish a world, explore it fully, and then settle. Listening to this symphony asks us to stay with what is there, rather than imagine what might have followed. It asks for patience, and for a willingness to accept that not every journey ends with resolution. Schubert would go on to write remarkable music in the years that followed, even as his health declined and his life grew shorter. The unfinished is not a farewell. It is a moment, preserved, a composer listening closely, writing with care, and allowing the music to end when it had said enough. And that may be why it still speaks so clearly. The sound fades, and nothing arrives to replace it.